All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or everyone who may be catching this playback. Please give me a like. I am starting this channel from scratch, and today I want to talk about the mystery surrounding Devon Wilson, who was a very infamous, very notorious groupie from back in the 70s. She was one of the few Black people that was actually in the inner circle of Jimi Hendrix. She was one of the few Black girlfriends that he did have throughout his lifetime. If you're a little bit familiar with the legendary guitarist Jimi Hendrix, he did get a lot of his fame and he did kind of rise to his success once he moved out of the United States and he moved over to London, England, which there are, of course, not a lot of people, excuse me, a lot of Black people over the pond, right? So I'm going to start sharing my screen here in a moment. Hopefully, this does work. And I want to delve a little bit into Devon Wilson. Now, Devon Wilson was born in the 40s, and it is hearsay that she is actually the niece of Quincy Jones. So, if that is true, that is how she would have been able to get access to some of the more famous men that she was connected to, right? So Devin Wilson, they're saying that she was romantically linked to Jimi Hendrix, Mick Jagger, Brian Jones from the Rolling Stones, Eric Clapton, Dwayne Allman, Miles Davis, and Quincy Jones. Just as a forethought, I'll probably do some content on the very controversial life of Miles Davis as well. But I'm going to save that for later, right? Basically, Devin Wilson was on the streets of Las Vegas by the time she was 15, and she became a prostitute. Once she settled in New York, she became a regular at places like the Scene and the Fillmore East. Now, insert Jimi Hendrix, which is when she meets him in 1965. They begin an on and off relationship, but they never got married. Some do say that Devin was the closest thing to a wife that Jimi Hendrix did have, but that they did have a open relationship. Devin was bisexual, and she often procured women for Jimmy to have sex with, right? This goes on to note that Devin did openly engage in threesomes and orgies, and that she was obsessed with Jimi Hendrix. Now, uh, basically, a lot of people that gave kind of stories about who Devin Wilson was and her demeanor, they would state that she was very aggressive and protective of Jimmy. She was kind of like, um, his protector, I would say. Or I guess a better word for this would be a handler, even though she was not a manager for Jimi Hendrix. Some would feel that she was kind of in that role as a handler. Basically, Devin, that whole lifestyle that a lot of people had in the 60s and 70s was kind of the hippie, free love, free spirit, very hedonistic, indulge in any and everything that they could basically get their hands on, right? So it's not surprising that Devin did live a very hard lifestyle with Jimmy. She was addicted to cocaine and heroin, which heroin was actually a lot more popular. Back in those days, Janis Joplin did die close around to this time. Jimmy died from a heroin overdose as well, right? Let me go ahead and skip over to the part that kind of seems like an abstract enigma, right? Let me start with a book that actually came out, and this book was about Chelsea Hotel. And this book had a few chapters in it, and the chapters were one of the chapters stated Chelsea girl killed Jimi Hendrix. Now, this Chelsea girl that they were speaking of in this book about the Chelsea Hotel was actually Devon Wilson. Basically, I'm going to read a little bit of this here, and this is a excerpt from the book. This is an excerpt from Marlowe, who was a man that Devon Wilson actually did confide in as it concerned Jimi Hendrix, right? But I'm going to read a little bit of this, right? It states that Devon Wilson was a beautiful, troubled fashion model, best known for being one of Jimi Hendrix's closer girlfriends, a member of his inner circle whom Marlowe had met in LA during his flower child period of the late 60s, right? Basically, what happened is not long after Marlowe met Devon, she plunged to her death out of a ninth floor window at the Chelsea Hotel. Now, the crazy thing about this is Devon Wilson died 6 months after Jimi Hendrix died, and they ruled her death a suicide, but many feel that it was a murder, right? Basically, why many feel that it was a murder is because around before the period that she died, Devon Wilson was actually giving information about her actions and the things that she was doing with Jimmy prior to her death, right? So the thing that happened here, let me go ahead and get to this excerpt. Bear with me one moment here. Okay. So basically, after Jimi Hendrix died, right, she confided in this gentleman, Marlowe, that she was distraught and that she felt guilty that she may have had something to do with the death of Jimi Hendrix, which this was Devon. Now, Devon had made Jimi Hendrix a cup of coffee and she had put a tablespoon of heroin in the cup of coffee. Now, she said Devon stated that the only time that her and Jimi Hendrix were sexually intimate was when they were on heroin, which made Jimi Hendrix feel all lovey dovey. Otherwise, Jimmy basically didn't want anything to do with Devon, right? Jimmy was very, very famous. So everyone usually they would call them jam sessions back in the day where everybody would pick up their instrument and kind of just freestyle and create music. So there are a lot of men that were approaching Jimmy to create music, or a lot of women constantly fawning over Jimmy for his attention, right? So basically, Devon would use a ploy that she was going to get Jimi Hendrix high on heroin to be intimate with him. But apparently, what Devon Wilson did not know is the day that she gave Jimmy some heroin in his coffee, that Jimi Hendrix had been partying all day and he had already been shooting up heroin throughout most of that day, right? So many feel that this additional dose of heroin that Devon gave Jimmy actually put him over the edge, and this could have contributed to his overdose. If you're familiar a little bit with how Jimi Hendrix passed away, he passed away from asphyxiation, which basically meant that he was kind of overdosing and having convulsions, and he began to vomit and try to regurgitate some of the fluid in his lungs. Now, when he couldn't do that, uh, either from being passed out or what have you, that eventually caused his asphyxiation and his lungs overfilled with liquid. And this is what caused Jimi Hendrix's cause of death, right? Now, to take a step back to Devon, basically, they're stating that the terrible guilt complex about Jimi Hendrix and that final dose of heroin that she gave him made her go on a confession spree. And they are stating that she told the wrong people this, apparently, and she was not pushed to her death out of it was either the eighth or ninth floor Chelsea Hotel, that she did not jump to her death. Someone actually pushed her to her death, right? So, you know, in reference to um, Devon Wilson, right? I don't think that Devon Wilson actually killed herself. I think that she knew a little bit more of what was going on. And I think that someone actually pushed her out of the window of the Chelsea Hotel. Now, it's also rumored that Devon Wilson could have potentially been pregnant with Mick Jagger's child at the time that she was pushed out of the window to her death. Or it's also stated that she could have had this child, or um, something along the lines that she could have had an abortion, right? Now, none of this can be confirmed because around this period of the 70s, unlike now where you have so many receipts from social media, a lot of stuff that happened in the 70s is retold through verbal accounts. And like that game used to play telephone back in the day, a lot of the accounts that are retold verbally tend to get lost in the sauce, right? For lack of a better word, or a lot of details tend to get misconstrued. So basically, because I don't think that Devon's death was an accident, I'm sorry, a suicide, and I do think that she was potentially murdered. Um, I think what really happened with Jimi Hendrix is, I think it's more along the lines of one of his managers could have killed him. And the reason why I came to this conclusion when I was actually looking into a lot of this information has to do with a article that came up, right? Now, Jimi Hendrix had a lot of girlfriends back in the day when he was in his heyday, in his prime prior to his death. And one of these girlfriends was Monica. Now, when Jimi Hendrix passed away, he passed away somewhere between 7 and 8 a.m. And she called his handlers immediately as soon as he passed away. The paramedics in London, England, actually did not arrive. She did not contact them until it was like 11 or 11:30. There's also a lot of gaps in her story on how she retold the story, as well as the details of what Jimi Hendrix was consuming prior to his death in that hotel room that they were in, right? So there's also another article that came up in concern to Jimi Hendrix, and that article basically states that Jimi Hendrix was indeed murdered, right? How Jimi Hendrix died and the mysterious surroundings of his death. And this article does go on to state that Jimi Hendrix was murdered by a manager with debts to the mafia. Now, it poses this as a question. Uh, the biographer that actually researched this, Harry Shapiro, was very close to Jimi Hendrix. Now, here's the very ironic thing, right? Along with Devon Wilson confessing what she was doing with Jimi Hendrix, there was also someone else who was confessing the last details as it concerns Jimi Hendrix, right? In the 60s, let's see, it was either the 60s or the 70s. Give me one moment. Let me go ahead and pull up this excerpt here. Hopefully, my screen is being shared and I can see this. Okay, so Jimi Hendrix had a manager by the name of Mike Jeffrey, right? And Mike Jeffrey was with another gentleman named Tappy. And basically, what he stated was when they were talking, Mike began to get very agitated. And he basically confessed that he had no choice. He had to do it. When asked what Mike was referring to, Mike told Tappy, "You know exactly what I'm talking about. It was either that or I'd be broke or dead." Now, the mafia was very prevalent back in this period. They played no games as far as getting debts back any way they saw fit or by any means necessary, right? Now, basically, he's stating that he had to confirm suspicions that he had, but that a lot of people were too scared to come forward and say anything about Mike, who was in Jimmy's circle, right? Here's the crazy part about this story, right? There's Mike stated that he gave a few details to this Tappy gentleman, and Tappy did not press him further. All he said was he got a few of his friends, he does not know who they were, and it was just booze down the windpipe, like in that film Get Carter. Now, booze directly down someone's windpipe is, I don't want to say it's waterboarding per se, but it's a different type of procedure that you would do to someone to basically fill their lungs up with fluid so they would die from asphyxiation. Now, as we know, this is exactly how Jimi Hendrix actually died, right? The crazy thing about this is a month later, Mike Jeffrey was dead, right? When he was flying back, and this article basically states that Mike Jeffrey was someone who was terrified of flying and that he was in the habit of making several reservations at once and then choosing his flight at the last minute to escape the fates, right? But on March 5th of 1973, his luck ran out and he got on a flight that ended his life, right? And basically, what happened was no one, if I'm reading this correctly, if I can remember this one correctly, no one survived on that flight, right? So there's a lot of ironies here that happen surrounding the characters of Jimi Hendrix's death. And no one can confirm all of the holes in the details in his autopsy report. The medical examiner's report were not as thorough back then, especially in another country, London, England. You would not have had as many details as you have over here. So the autopsy report has holes in it. The character witnesses, they have holes in their story, especially the person who was in the room with him, this Monica woman. She does not have a consistent story at all. And I just find it ironic how a lot of the information does bring up Devon Wilson, as she was one of the only other Black people in his circle, right? That would have been around Jimi Hendrix at the time, right? So I just kind of wanted to go ahead and do a live stream a little bit on this one. There's a lot of theories concerning how Jimi Hendrix actually died. And I must admit, this is one of the ones that are a little bit more mysterious because the holes have not been connected. No matter how much you research it, it kind of seems to lead into a roadblock. We know that Jimi Hendrix did pass away from asphyxiation, but whether he was physically asphyxiated or whether that was an overdose tends to remain a gray area, right? All right, that is going to be it for this one. I please like, share, subscribe for the stream. I hope everyone has a great day. Peace.